September 1944, northeastern France. In exactly 47 seconds, 89 German Panther tanks, each weighing 45 tons of hardened steel and carrying enough ammunition to level a city block, would roll into the most devastating ambush in armored warfare history. The German commanders sitting in their cupolas had absolutely no idea they were driving straight into a brilliantly designed killing zone that would turn their unstoppable counteroffensive into a burning graveyard of twisted metal and shattered dreams. Hey, if you're loving this deep dive into military history's most insane moments, smash that like button and subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next episode, where we uncover the forgotten heroes and shocking tactical genius that changed the course of World War II. Join our community of history enthusiasts, and let's explore these incredible stories together. The German High Command called it Operation Panzerstreik. American historians would later call it the Battle of Ericourt. But to the exhausted tank crews of the U.S. 4th Armored Division, who survived those brutal 11 days in September 1944, it had a much simpler name. They called it the Turkey Shoot. Because that's exactly what it became when 300 of Hitler's newest, heaviest, most technologically advanced Panther tanks tried to crush what appeared to be an exposed, vulnerable, hopelessly overextended American spearhead stuck deep in enemy territory. The Germans lost nearly 300 armored vehicles in exchange for destroying less than 40 American tanks. It was a catastrophic defeat that stunned the entire German military establishment. And it all started because Adolf Hitler himself made one fatal, arrogant assumption. He looked at General George S. Patton's lightning-fast advance across France and genuinely believed the legendary American commander had finally made a suicidal tactical mistake. But here's the twist that the German generals never saw coming. Patton hadn't made a mistake at all. He had deliberately, intentionally, brilliantly positioned his forces in what appeared to be a vulnerable position for one very specific reason. He wanted the Germans to attack. He was begging them to come out of their defensive positions and fight him in the open field. Because Patton and his subordinate commander, Major General John S. Wood, had developed a revolutionary new approach to armored warfare that would completely shatter the traditional German understanding of tank combat. They had turned every supposed weakness into a devastating strength. And when the German panzers finally took the bait and launched their massive counteroffensive, they walked straight into a tactical masterpiece that would prove once and for all whose military doctrine was truly superior. Let me take you back to early September 1944, when the entire strategic situation on the Western Front was changing with unprecedented, almost unbelievable speed. Following the successful D-Day landings in Normandy 3 months earlier, the Allied armies had spent weeks grinding through the nightmare terrain of the Norman hedgerows. These ancient farming boundaries, thick earthen berms covered with centuries-old vegetation, created perfect natural defensive positions. Every field became a fortress. Every road became a killing zone. The German defenders made the Americans and British pay in blood for every single yard of muddy French farmland. But on July 25th, everything changed. Operation Cobra, a massive American offensive led by General Omar Bradley, finally punched a hole through the German defensive line. And the moment that gap opened, General George S. Patton's newly activated Third Army poured through like water bursting from a shattered dam. What followed was one of the most spectacular displays of mobile warfare in military history. Patton's armored columns didn't just advance. They exploded across the French countryside at speeds that military textbooks had previously declared impossible. They covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, moving so fast they literally drove off the edges of their own operational maps. The German armies in France, already battered and demoralized from months of brutal fighting, simply disintegrated in the face of Patton's relentless pursuit. Entire divisions surrendered without firing a shot. Supply depots were captured intact. Strategic bridges were seized before German engineers could demolish them. By early September, Patton's Third Army had crossed the Meuse River, then the Moselle River, pushing deep into the Lorraine region of northeastern France. They were now less than 100 miles from the German border itself, but this incredible speed created an equally incredible problem. The faster Patton moved, the further he stretched his supply lines. And in the brutal mathematics of military logistics, distance equals vulnerability. Every gallon of gasoline, every artillery shell, every box of ammunition had to be trucked hundreds of miles from the supply depots on the Normandy coast all the way to the rapidly advancing front lines. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system operated primarily by African-American quartermaster units, worked around the clock in a heroic effort to keep Patton's tanks fueled and his guns firing. But even their superhuman efforts couldn't keep pace with Patton's insatiable appetite for fuel and ammunition. By mid-September, the Third Army was quite literally running on fumes. Tank platoons were halting in the middle of advances because they had completely exhausted their fuel supplies. Artillery batteries were rationing shells. The entire offensive was grinding to a halt, not because of German resistance, but because of simple logistical reality. And, at the very tip of Patton's spearhead, at the absolute furthest point of the American advance, sat the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General John S. Wood. Wood was a fascinating character, a brilliant but difficult cavalry officer, who had spent his entire career thinking about the future of mechanized warfare. His men called him Tiger Jack because of his aggressive, relentless tactical style. Wood absolutely hated defensive warfare. He hated sitting still. He hated waiting for orders. He believed that armored divisions should operate like cavalry raiders from the Old West, striking deep into enemy territory, bypassing strong points, creating chaos and confusion in the enemy's rear areas. Wood frequently clashed with his superiors because he would rather ask for forgiveness than permission. He commanded from the front lines rather than a safe headquarters in the rear. And he shared Patton's absolute obsession with speed and mobility. Under Wood's aggressive leadership, the 4th Armored Division had pushed further and faster than any other unit in the entire Allied Army. By September 15th, they had crossed the Moselle River near the small French town of Ericourt and established a bridgehead on the eastern bank. But in doing so, they had completely outrun the rest of the Third Army. The infantry divisions that were supposed to protect their flanks were still miles behind, struggling to catch up. The supply trucks were running in a constant shuttle back and forth, burning precious fuel to deliver more fuel. The 4th Armored Division was sitting at the end of an incredibly long, incredibly fragile supply line that stretched all the way back to the beaches of Normandy, more than 300 miles away. Even worse, their rapid advance had created massive gaps on both their northern and southern flanks. They were sticking out into enemy territory like an exposed finger, completely isolated with German forces on 3 sides. From a classical military perspective, it looked like a disaster waiting to happen. Any competent enemy commander, looking at the situation on a map, would immediately recognize it as an opportunity. The 4th Armored Division appeared to be vulnerable, overextended, and ripe for destruction. And that's exactly what the German High Command thought when they saw the American positions around Ericourt. Deep inside his fortified command bunker, Adolf Hitler stared at the operational maps of the Western Front with growing excitement. For months, the German dictator had watched in helpless frustration as his armies retreated across France. The supposedly invincible Wehrmacht had been routed, humiliated, driven back in disorder. But now, looking at the current tactical situation, Hitler saw something he hadn't seen in a very long time. He saw an opportunity. He saw a chance to strike back, to bloody the Americans, to prove that the German army was still a force to be feared. The German generals agreed. They looked at Patton's exposed position and came to a unanimous conclusion. The legendary American commander had finally made a catastrophic mistake. His aggressive, arrogant drive across France had violated every fundamental principle of sound military strategy. He had advanced without properly securing his flanks. He had pushed his armor far beyond the protective support of his infantry. He had wildly overextended his logistics. From the rigid German perspective, Patton had allowed his ego and his famous impatience to blind him to tactical reality. He was walking into a trap of his own making. Hitler immediately ordered a massive armored counteroffensive designed to exploit this perceived American blunder. The plan was brutally simple. German forces would launch a powerful armored strike directly into the exposed flanks of the 4th Armored Division. They would sever Wood's supply lines, isolate his tanks from the rest of the Third Army, and annihilate the American spearhead in detail. If successful, this counteroffensive would break the momentum of Patton's entire offensive, buying Germany precious time to rebuild its shattered defenses. To guarantee success, Hitler committed some of his best remaining assets in the West. He ordered the deployment of the 5th Panzer Army, commanded by General Hasso von Manteuffel, one of Germany's most experienced and capable tank commanders. Manteuffel was a veteran of brutal armored combat on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. He understood mobile warfare. He understood how to coordinate combined arms attacks. He was exactly the kind of professional, competent commander the Germans needed. Under Manteufel's command were two newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and 113th. These weren't scraped-together formations of old men and boys. These were fresh, fully equipped, highly motivated units. And most importantly, they were heavily equipped with the Panzerkampfwagen 5, universally known as the Panther tank. The Panther was widely considered the finest medium tank of World War II. Its thick sloped frontal armor was virtually impenetrable to the standard 75mm gun of the American M4 Sherman tank at normal combat ranges. The Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman from over a mile away, long before the American tank could get close enough to return effective fire. The Germans also had one crucial environmental advantage working in their favor. The weather in Lorraine had turned absolutely miserable. Heavy autumn rains had turned the roads to mud and the fields to swamps. Thick morning fog blanketed the entire region, reducing visibility to less than 50 yards. This heavy fog grounded the dreaded American fighter bombers, completely negating the Allied advantage of air superiority. Without aircraft to protect them, the American tanks would have to fight the superior Panthers purely on the ground, armor against armor. On paper, the upcoming battle looked like an absolute disaster for the Americans. The Germans had better tanks. They had the element of surprise. The weather was on their side. They were attacking an isolated, overextended division whose commander had supposedly been blinded by arrogance. German intelligence predicted a quick, decisive victory. They expected to sweep through the morning fog, crush the lighter American tanks, and hand General Patton the most humiliating defeat of his career. But there was one absolutely fundamental flaw in the German assessment. One critical miscalculation that would prove fatal. General George S. Patton and General John S. Wood were not blind amateurs. They weren't ignoring their exposed flanks out of stupidity or arrogance. They knew exactly where they were. They knew exactly how vulnerable their positions looked on a map. They were acutely aware of the massive German armored formations gathering in the forest to the east. And they were absolutely, completely, perfectly prepared for what was coming. Because General Wood didn't view his isolated position at Ericourt as a dangerous trap. He viewed it as the ultimate tactical bait. Wood was a revolutionary thinker in American armored doctrine. He fundamentally rejected the idea that tanks should be used to slowly grind against fortified defensive lines. He believed armor should be employed in fluid, dynamic, highly mobile warfare. And most importantly, he specifically wanted the German panzers to come out of their defensive positions and attack him in the open field, where his highly trained crews could use their superior mechanical reliability, faster coordination, and brilliant tactical flexibility to outmaneuver the heavier, slower German machines. Wood deliberately kept his forces highly dispersed around the town of Ericourt. He didn't order his men to dig deep trenches or construct static defensive lines, which would only make them sitting targets for the heavy German guns. Instead, he prepared what military historians would later call an elastic mobile defense. He positioned his reliable Sherman tanks, his incredibly fast M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, and his mechanized infantry in concealed, mutually supporting positions, hidden among the rolling hills and thick morning fog. Each unit knew exactly where the others were positioned. Each commander had clear radio communication. Each crew understood their role in the coming battle. But Wood's defensive preparation went far beyond just positioning his tanks cleverly. He had a secret weapon that the rigid German military structure fundamentally underestimated: the incredible flexibility and devastating speed of American artillery. Through a highly sophisticated network of forward observers equipped with portable radios, any American tank commander or infantry lieutenant could instantly call down a massive concentrated barrage from multiple artillery battalions simultaneously. They could drop a devastating wall of high explosives on exact coordinates within minutes. This was a revolutionary capability that the Germans simply didn't possess. German artillery units operated independently, required lengthy approval processes, and lacked the sophisticated radio networks that made American fire support so terrifyingly effective. When an American commander on the ground spotted enemy armor concentrations, he could have shells falling on that position before the German tanks even realized they'd been observed. The American commanders also understood something profound about the mechanical differences between their tanks and the German Panthers. Yes, the Panther had superior armor and a more powerful gun, but it also had critical weaknesses. The Panther was mechanically unreliable, prone to transmission failures and engine problems. It had incredibly slow manual turret traverse speeds, meaning it took precious seconds to swing the main gun from one target to another. And critically, most German tanks lacked the sophisticated radio equipment that was standard in every single American vehicle. By contrast, the American M4 Sherman tanks and the M18 Hellcat tank destroyers were highly reliable machines that could operate for days without mechanical failure. They featured powered turrets that could snap to a new target in seconds, and they possessed excellent radios that allowed every single vehicle to communicate, adapt, and coordinate instantly. This communication advantage would prove absolutely devastating in the chaotic fog-shrouded environment of the coming battle. The M18 Hellcat deserves special mention because it represented a completely different philosophy of armored warfare. American engineers had deliberately stripped away heavy armor to maximize speed and acceleration. The Hellcat could reach speeds of 50 miles per hour, making it the fastest tracked vehicle of the entire war. Armed with a high-velocity 76mm gun, Hellcat crews were trained in shoot-and-scoot tactics. They would race to a concealed flanking position, fire a devastating armor-piercing round directly into the weaker side armor of a German Panther, and accelerate away before the enemy could even identify where the shot came from. This was a radically different approach from the German emphasis on heavy armor and powerful guns. The Americans had chosen mobility and coordination over raw firepower. They had chosen flexibility over rigid tactical doctrine, and they were about to prove that in modern mechanized warfare, speed and communication could defeat superior armor. As the cold morning of September 18, 1944, dawned over the foggy landscape of Lorraine, the heavy metallic engines of hundreds of German Panther tanks roared to life. The massive panzer brigades began their rumbling advance, moving through the thick morning mist with complete confidence. The German tank commanders sat in their cupolas, convinced they were executing a brilliant surprise attack. They believed they were about to slice through the vulnerable American flank and deliver a crushing, humiliating defeat to the overconfident General Patton. The lead elements of the 111th Panzer Brigade approached the town of Luneville just south of Aricourt. The German commanders peered through their vision blocks, straining to see through the thick fog that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. They expected to find chaos. They expected to find panicked American supply trucks and terrified infantry fleeing in disorder. They expected easy targets and quick victory. Instead, as the heavy German Panthers lumbered forward into the open fields, the surrounding hills suddenly erupted in a terrifying storm of coordinated, highly accurate, armor-piercing fire. General Wood's 4th Armored Division was waiting for them. The trap had been sprung, and the Germans had driven straight into it with their eyes wide open. The opening minutes of the Battle of Aricourt shattered every German assumption about American tactical capability. The Panthers, advancing blindly through the fog, immediately began taking devastating hits from multiple directions. American Sherman tanks, carefully hidden behind stone farmhouses and positioned hull down behind small hills, held their fire with absolute discipline until the German tanks were at close range. Then they fired concentrated volleys, aimed specifically at the weaker side and rear armor of the Panthers. The American gunners didn't waste ammunition trying to penetrate the thick frontal armor of the German tanks. They had been trained to maneuver to flank to find the weak points. A Sherman would score a hit, and then instantly throw its engines into reverse, disappearing back into the thick fog before the slow-turning turret of the Panther could even acquire the target. It was fluid, chaotic, highly mobile combat that the rigid German tactical doctrine had never prepared them for. The M18 Hellcats were even more devastating. These lightning-fast tank destroyers raced across the battlefield at speeds the heavy Panthers couldn't match. They would appear suddenly from an unexpected angle, fire a high-velocity 76mm round into the side of a German tank, and vanish before the Germans could react. The Panther crews, trained to fight in methodical, organized formations, were completely overwhelmed by this aggressive, unpredictable American approach. Within hours, the German offensive had lost all coherence. Individual Panther tanks became separated in the fog, blundering blindly into American kill zones. Without effective radio communication between vehicles, German tank commanders had no idea where their supporting units were positioned. They couldn't coordinate their movements. They couldn't call for help. They were fighting blind, while the Americans with their superior radio networks maintained perfect situational awareness. But the American tanks weren't fighting alone. As the fog began to thin slightly in the late morning, American forward observers positioned on the high ground overlooking the valleys finally caught sight of the massive German armored concentrations. Using their portable radios, these highly trained observers instantly contacted the fire direction centers of multiple artillery battalions located miles behind the front lines. The response was instantaneous and apocalyptic. Within 3 minutes of a radio call, the sky above the German panzers filled with the terrifying rushing scream of incoming shells. The American artillery batteries fired with an intensity and mathematical precision that left the German commanders absolutely stunned. They dropped massive continuous barrages of high explosive and white phosphorus shells directly onto the advancing German columns. The heavy, relentless artillery fire shattered the optics of the Panther tanks, completely destroyed the lighter supply vehicles, and violently separated the German armored spearheads from their vital infantry support. Panther crews found themselves isolated under fire from multiple directions, unable to see their targets, unable to communicate with their command, and unable to escape the killing zone they had driven into. The commander of the German 5th Panzer Army, General Hasso von Manteuffel, listened to the frantic, fragmented radio reports coming from the front line with growing horror. The intelligence assessments he had received from Berlin were entirely catastrophically wrong. The American flank was not an exposed, vulnerable target. It was a highly organized, lethal defensive network. Patton had not made a fatal logistical mistake. He had simply positioned a fully prepared, incredibly dangerous armored fist and dared the Germans to punch it. By the end of the first day of fighting, the 111th Panzer Brigade had been practically shattered. The green fields around Ericourt were littered with burning, smoking remains of dozens of German Panther tanks. The American 4th Armored Division had successfully absorbed the initial massive shock of the German counteroffensive and thrown it back with devastating coordinated force. But the battle was far from over. Deep in his underground bunker, Adolf Hitler refused to accept the reality of the tactical situation. He refused to believe that his fresh, heavily armored panzer brigades were being systematically dismantled by lighter American forces. Driven by desperate, fanatical need for a major victory, Hitler absolutely forbade any retreat. He issued a rigid, inflexible order. The Germans would regroup, absorb their losses, and attack again the very next morning. The German generals on the ground knew it was suicide. They had lost surprise. They had lost momentum. And most terrifyingly, as the sun began to set on September 18th, they looked up at the sky and realized their greatest environmental advantage was vanishing. The thick protective fog that had covered Lorraine was beginning to lift. The forecast for tomorrow called for completely clear open skies. For the American tank crews, those clearing skies meant one thing. The ultimate terrifying power of the United States military was about to arrive. The heavy German Panthers had failed to break through in the fog. Now they would face the full combined might of American armor and air power in broad daylight. And that meant the real slaughter was about to begin. September 19th, 1944. The fog had lifted. The sky over Ericourt was a brilliant, merciless blue. And the German panzer brigades, which had confidently expected to crush the isolated American 4th Armored Division, were about to discover that they had driven into something far worse than a tactical trap. They had entered a killing zone, where American combined arms warfare would demonstrate its absolute terrifying superiority. But before we witness the complete destruction of Hitler's armored counteroffensive, let's understand exactly what had happened in the first 24 hours. General Wood's 4th Armored Division, supposedly overextended and vulnerable, had absorbed a massive German attack in the fog and thrown it back with devastating losses. The 111th Panzer Brigade was shattered. Dozens of supposedly invincible Panther tanks lay burning in the fields around Ericourt. The Germans had lost the element of surprise. They had lost their momentum. And now they were about to lose their one environmental advantage. The protective fog was gone. And with those clear skies came the ultimate weapon in General George S. Patton's arsenal: American air power. Deep in the German command bunkers, the realization was setting in. The intelligence assessments from Berlin had been catastrophically, fatally wrong. This wasn't an exposed American flank, ripe for exploitation. This was a fully prepared, brilliantly coordinated defensive network backed by overwhelming firepower. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commander of the 5th Panzer Army, stared at the casualty reports with growing horror. In a single day of fighting, his fresh panzer brigades had suffered losses that would normally take weeks of sustained combat to accumulate. And Adolf Hitler's response to this tactical disaster: attack again. Immediately. No retreat, no regrouping. Just throw more armor into the meat grinder. The German commanders on the ground knew it was suicide. but orders were orders. As dawn broke on September 19th, the surviving Panthers of the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades formed up for another assault. Their commanders looked up at the clear sky with absolute dread. Without fog to hide their movements, they would be completely exposed, completely vulnerable, completely doomed. General George S. Patton commanded more than just tanks and artillery. He controlled a revolutionary integrated combat system that military historians would later recognize as the birth of modern combined arms warfare. And the most devastating component of that system was the 19th Tactical Air Command, led by Brigadier General Otto P. Wayland. Patton and Wayland had created something unprecedented in military history. A perfect fusion of ground and air forces operating as a single coordinated machine. Unlike traditional military structures, where the Army and Air Force operated as separate competing entities, Patton had embedded highly trained air liaison officers directly into his leading combat units. These forward air controllers sat inside Sherman tanks equipped with specialized VHF radios. They could see the battlefield from ground level and communicate instantly with the squadrons of fighter bombers circling overhead. When the fog lifted on September 19th, these controllers looked up through their tank hatches and made contact with massive formations of Republic P-47 Thunderbolts waiting above the clouds. The P-47 Thunderbolt was a beast of an aircraft, heavily armored, incredibly rugged, powered by a massive radial engine that could absorb tremendous punishment and keep flying. The pilots affectionately called it the Jug because of its barrel-shaped fuselage. But there was nothing affectionate about what it could do to ground targets. Each Thunderbolt carried 8.50 caliber heavy machine guns, high-velocity rockets, and 500-pound bombs. It was essentially a flying arsenal specifically designed for one purpose: destroying enemy armor. As the German Panzer Brigades began their second assault, attempting to regroup and push through the American lines, the Thunderbolts descended from the clear morning sky like mechanical birds of prey. The air controllers on the ground guided them directly onto the German armored columns with pinpoint precision. The results were absolutely catastrophic. The P-47s fired volleys of high-velocity rockets directly into the thin top armor of the Panthers, the one area where the German tanks were genuinely vulnerable. Massive explosions ripped through the cramped crew compartments, turrets were blown completely off their ring mounts, ammunition stores detonated in spectacular fireballs. The fighter bombers dropped heavy bombs on German supply trucks, fuel tankers, and ammunition carriers. They strafed infantry positions with devastating .50 caliber fire. The German formations, already battered and disorganized from the previous day's ground combat, were completely paralyzed by this relentless assault from above. Panther crews abandoned their disabled vehicles and ran for cover in the tree lines. Officers lost a psychological blow. The carefully maintained myth of Panther superiority was broken. The supposedly amateur Americans had proven themselves masters of modern mechanized warfare. Military analysts on both sides studied the battle intensely. The Germans tried to understand how their fresh armored brigades had been so completely defeated. They examined captured American equipment. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed after-action reports. And slowly, the terrible truth emerged. The Americans hadn't won through superior equipment. The Sherman was still inferior to the Panther in direct combat. The Americans had won through superior doctrine, superior coordination, and superior integration of combined arms. The Battle of Aricourt proved definitively that World War II armored warfare had evolved beyond the simple equation of tank versus tank. Victory belonged to the force that could best coordinate armor, infantry, artillery, and air power into a seamless killing machine. The Americans had mastered this integration. The Germans, for all their technical prowess and tactical experience, had not. For General George S. Patton, Aricourt vindicated his entire operational philosophy. Speed was not reckless. Aggressive advancement was not foolish overextension. When backed by brilliant subordinate commanders like John S. Wood, supported by overwhelming logistics, and protected by devastating combined arms coordination, rapid mobile warfare was the ultimate form of both offense and defense. Patton had deliberately positioned his forces in what appeared to be a vulnerable position. He had dared the Germans to attack, and when they took the bait, he had destroyed them. The strategic implications were enormous. Hitler's counteroffensive at Aricourt had been designed to halt Patton's advance, buy time to rebuild German defenses, and prove that the Wehrmacht could still deliver decisive victories. Instead, it had accomplished the exact opposite. Germany's precious armored reserves had been wasted in a futile assault. Patton's momentum, briefly slowed by fuel shortages, would soon resume, and the road to the German border lay open. But this story has one final chapter, a chapter about the man who stood at the center of this tactical masterpiece. What happened to General John S. Wood, the brilliant but difficult commander who turned Ericourt into a graveyard for German armor? What became of his revolutionary ideas about mobile warfare? And what lessons did military forces around the world learn from those 11 days in September 1944, when American combined arms doctrine came of age? The answers might surprise you. From a cavalry officer with a reputation for being difficult and aggressive to the architect of one of the most devastating defensive victories in armored warfare history, General John S. Wood proved that speed and coordination could defeat superior firepower. His 4th Armored Division had destroyed nearly 300 German tanks while losing fewer than 40 of their own. The Battle of Ericourt had demonstrated American combined arms superiority beyond any doubt. But here's the twist that almost nobody knows. The man who created this tactical masterpiece, the brilliant commander who turned Patton's fatal mistake into Germany's catastrophe, never received the recognition he deserved. And his story after Ericourt reveals something profound about military institutions, innovation, and the price of being right when everyone else is wrong. Because success, as it turns out, sometimes comes with a terrible cost. When the guns finally fell silent over Ericourt on September 29, 1944, General John S. Wood should have been celebrated as one of America's greatest tactical minds. His innovative mobile defense doctrine had just shattered Hitler's armored counteroffensive. His brilliant integration of tanks, tank destroyers, artillery, and air power had created a killing zone so effective that German commanders were literally refusing to send more units into it. Military analysts on both sides recognized Ericourt as a watershed moment in armored warfare. This should have been Wood's triumph. But Tiger Jack Wood was a difficult man. He argued constantly with his superiors. He ignored orders he considered stupid. He commanded from the front lines instead of safe headquarters in the rear. He believed that armored divisions should operate as independent raiding forces, striking deep into enemy territory, without waiting for infantry support. And these beliefs put him in direct conflict with more conservative American commanders who favored cautious, methodical advances. Just weeks after his stunning victory at Ericourt, Wood clashed with his corps commander over tactics during the approach to the German border. Wood wanted to continue his aggressive mobile operations. His superiors wanted him to slow down and consolidate. The argument became heated. Wood was relieved of command of the 4th Armored Division in December 1944, just 3 months after his greatest tactical achievement. He spent the rest of the war in staff positions, watching from the sidelines as other commanders led his division. The man who had proven that American armored doctrine could defeat the best the Germans had to offer was pushed aside because he refused to conform. Wood retired from the army in 1946, bitter and largely forgotten. He died in 1969 at age 74, having spent his final years watching the military he loved adopt many of the tactical innovations he had championed without ever acknowledging his contributions. History remembered Patton as the great armored commander of World War II. Wood, the brilliant tactician who actually executed many of Patton's most successful operations, faded into obscurity. But the other men of Ericourt had different fates. The tank crews and artillery observers who executed Wood's defensive masterpiece went home as part of the victorious 4th Armored Division. Many received Bronze Stars and Silver Stars for their actions in those 11 days of brutal fighting. The division itself lost all contact with their units. The carefully planned German counteroffensive dissolved into chaos and panic. But General John S. Wood wasn't content to simply defend. He recognized instantly that the Germans were stunned, confused, and completely off balance. This was the moment to transition from defense to aggressive counterattack. Wood unleashed his armored battalions across the entire sector. American Sherman tanks and M18 Hellcat tank destroyers surged forward using their superior speed and mechanical reliability to aggressively outflank the heavy, slow-turning German positions. The tactical coordination between American tanks on the ground and fighter bombers in the sky was flawless. It was a terrifying display of what modern warfare had become. When an American tank platoon encountered a heavily fortified German defensive position, they didn't waste time launching costly frontal assaults. They simply marked the position with colored smoke grenades and radioed for air support. Within minutes, thunderbolts would dive on the target and obliterate it with rockets and bombs. Then the American armor would roll forward through the smoking wreckage. The German 5th Panzer Army, personally designated by Adolf Hitler to deliver a crushing blow to the Americans, was being systematically dismantled. By September 20th, the scale of the disaster was impossible to hide. The 113th Panzer Brigade, which had entered the battle fresh and fully equipped, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force. German tank crews were abandoning their Panthers and retreating on foot. The vaunted German armored offensive had turned into a desperate struggle for survival. But the Americans weren't just winning tactically, they were demonstrating a fundamental revolution in military doctrine. The Germans had built their entire armored warfare philosophy around the superiority of their heavy tanks. The Panther was supposed to be invincible. Its thick armor and powerful gun were supposed to dominate any battlefield. But Patton and Wood had proven that in modern mechanized warfare, mobility and coordination trumped raw firepower. Speed and communication defeated heavy armor. Flexibility overcame rigid doctrine. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyers were the perfect embodiment of this philosophy. Stripped of heavy armor to maximize speed, these vehicles could reach 50 miles per hour and maneuver circles around the ponderous Panthers. Hellcat crews would race to flanking positions, fire devastating shots into the weaker side armor of German tanks, and disappear before the enemy could react. They were hunting wolves against lumbering bears, and the bears were dying. The American artillery added another layer of devastation. Through their sophisticated radio networks, forward observers could call down concentrated fire from multiple battalions simultaneously. German armor concentrations would be identified, coordinates transmitted, and within 3 minutes, massive barrages of high-explosive shells would rain down with mathematical precision. The Germans had nothing equivalent. Their artillery operated independently, required lengthy approval chains, and lacked the communication systems that made American fire support so terrifyingly effective. By September 25th, the Battle of Aricourt had evolved into a one-sided slaughter. German commanders were desperately requesting permission to withdraw and consolidate their shattered forces. But Hitler refused. He kept ordering fresh units forward, feeding them piecemeal into the American killing zone. The 15th Panzer Grenadier Division was committed to the battle, then elements of the 11th Panzer Division. Each new German formation met the same fate. Overwhelming American firepower from ground and air. Brilliant tactical coordination. Relentless aggressive maneuvering. The final major German assault came on September 29th. One last desperate attempt to salvage something from the catastrophic offensive. The Germans assembled their remaining armor for a coordinated attack on multiple American positions simultaneously. But General Wood and his commanders were ready. They had spent 11 days perfecting their defensive tactics. Their crews knew every hill, every tree line, every kill zone in the Aricourt sector. When the Germans attacked, they drove straight into pre-planned ambushes, backed by overwhelming artillery support and devastating airstrikes. The slaughter was absolute. Within hours, the German assault collapsed completely. Burning Panthers littered the battlefield. German infantry surrendered in large groups. The 5th Panzer Army. Hitler's instrument for crushing Patton's overextended spearhead had been utterly destroyed. The final casualty figures told the story with brutal clarity. The Germans had lost nearly 300 tanks and assault guns. Thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Multiple divisions rendered combat ineffective. In stark contrast, the American 4th Armored Division had lost fewer than 40 operational vehicles. Their casualties were measured in dozens rather than thousands. They had fought outnumbered against technologically superior enemy armor and achieved one of the most lopsided victories in the history of armored warfare. The Germans had entered the battle confident in their tactical superiority. They had left it completely shattered. The news of the American victory at Aricourt spread rapidly through both armies. For American forces across Europe, it was an enormous morale boost. The legendary German panzer divisions weren't invincible. They could be outfought, outmaneuvered, and destroyed. For German forces, it was a devastating distinguished unit citation. These young Americans, many of them draftees with no prior military experience, had outfought elite German panzer troops and proved that American fighting men could master the most complex form of modern warfare. General Hasso von Manteuffel, the German commander whose 5th Panzer Army was destroyed at Aricourt, survived the war and later wrote extensively about his experiences. In his memoirs, he acknowledged the tactical brilliance of the American defense and admitted that German intelligence had completely underestimated American combined arms capabilities. The Panthers, he noted, were excellent tanks. But excellent tanks without adequate infantry support, artillery coordination, or air cover were just expensive targets. The real legacy of Aracourt wasn't in medals or promotions. It was in the fundamental transformation of how military forces understood armored warfare. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Aracourt became the foundation of modern combined arms doctrine. The seamless integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and air power that Wood and Wayland perfected became the standard template for American military operations. During the Korean War, American forces used similar tactics to devastating effect against North Korean and Chinese armor. In the Vietnam War, armed helicopters replaced P-47 Thunderbolts, but the principle remained the same: ground forces and air support operating as a single coordinated system. The Israelis studied Aracourt intensely and incorporated its lessons into their armored doctrine. During the Six-Day War in 1967, Israeli tank crews used mobile defense tactics remarkably similar to Wood's methods to defeat superior numbers of Soviet-supplied Arab armor. They emphasized speed coordination and aggressive counterattacks over static defensive positions. The results were devastatingly effective. The Soviet military, despite being on the winning side of World War II, recognized that their armored tactics were outdated compared to American methods. They spent decades studying Western combined arms doctrine and developing their own versions of the coordination systems that made Aracourt possible. By the 1980s, Soviet tactical manuals included case studies of American operations in France, including detailed analysis of the 4th Armored Division's defensive victory. Even today, American armored units train using scenarios directly derived from the Battle of Aracourt. The basic tactical problem remains relevant. How does a lighter, more mobile force defeat heavier, more powerful enemy armor? The answer, developed in those foggy fields of Lorraine in September 1944, still applies. Superior coordination, better communication, aggressive use of combined arms. These principles have proven timeless. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, which performed so brilliantly at Aracourt, established a design philosophy that continues today. Modern armored forces still build specialized tank destroyers that sacrifice heavy armor for speed and firepower. The concept of rapid mobile anti-tank platforms owes its existence to the success of the Hellcat crews, who raced through the morning fog around Aracourt, destroying Panthers with hit-and-run tactics. Military historians estimate that the tactical innovations proven at Aracourt shortened the war in Europe by weeks, possibly months. By demonstrating that German armored forces could be decisively defeated in the field, Aracourt destroyed Hitler's last hope of stabilizing the Western Front through counteroffensive action. The psychological impact was enormous. German commanders became increasingly defensive and cautious, unwilling to risk their precious remaining panzer divisions in offensive operations that might end in similar disasters. But the biggest lesson wasn't about technology or tactics. It was about innovation itself. The Battle of Aracourt proved something that military institutions constantly forget. The best ideas often come from difficult, unconventional people who refuse to accept traditional wisdom. John S. Wood was court-martialed twice early in his career for insubordination. He was nearly cashiered out of the Army multiple times for arguing with superiors. He was exactly the kind of officer that rigid military bureaucracies try to eliminate. But he was also brilliant. His understanding of mobile armored warfare was years ahead of his contemporaries. His willingness to experiment, to try unconventional tactics, to trust his subordinates, and give them freedom to adapt on the battlefield created the conditions for tactical masterpieces like Aracourt. The same qualities that made him difficult to work with made him an exceptional combat commander. History is full of similar examples. Billy Mitchell, the American air power pioneer, was court-martialed for his aggressive advocacy of strategic bombing. He was proven right, but only after being forced out of the service. John Boyd, the fighter pilot who revolutionized air combat tactics and strategic theory, spent his entire career fighting Pentagon bureaucracy and never rose above the rank of colonel. These men were right. They were also impossible to work with, and the military punished them for it. This pattern repeats constantly. Institutional resistance to innovation is one of the most consistent features of military organizations throughout history. The French developed excellent tank designs in the 1930s, but had terrible doctrine for employing them. The Germans developed the Panther tank, but failed to develop the logistics and combined arms coordination needed to use it effectively. The British pioneered radar technology, but initially rejected proposals for fighter control systems that would make radar tactically useful. In every case, the problem wasn't technological. It was institutional. Large bureaucratic organizations naturally resist change, especially change proposed by difficult subordinates who challenge established hierarchies. The same hierarchical structure that makes armies effective in executing orders makes them terrible at adapting to new realities. And there's one final detail about Aracourt that most people don't know. A detail that ties the entire story together in an unexpected way. In 1974, 5 years after John S. Wood's death, the U.S. Army opened a new facility at Fort Knox, Kentucky, dedicated to training armor officers in advanced tactics. The facility included a detailed terrain model of the Aracourt battlefield, used to teach young officers how Wood's 4th Armored Division had executed their mobile defense. Students studied the positioning of American units, the coordination with artillery and air support, the aggressive counterattacks that turned defense into offense. But here's the twist. The training scenarios explicitly avoided mentioning Wood by name. The official curriculum credited the victory to 4th Armored Division leadership and superior American combined arms doctrine. The difficult, argumentative cavalry officer, who actually designed and executed the entire operation, was written out of his own triumph. The Army was happy to learn from his tactics. They just didn't want to acknowledge the man. It wasn't until the 1990s when military historians began publishing detailed studies of the Lorraine campaign that Wood's central role in the Aracourt victory became widely known. Declassified German documents revealed that Manteuffel and other panzer commanders specifically identified the American general at Aracourt as having demonstrated exceptional tactical skill. American unit records showed clearly that the defensive dispositions, the coordination procedures, and the aggressive counterattack doctrine all originated with Wood himself. The man the Army tried to forget had been recognized by his enemies as a tactical genius. There's a certain poetry in that. From a difficult cavalry officer with ideas about mobile warfare that his superiors considered reckless to the architect of one of the most lopsided armored victories in military history. John S. Wood proved that innovation often comes from the people institutions least want to listen to. His 4th Armored Division destroyed 300 German tanks while losing 40. They shattered Hitler's last major armored offensive in the West. They demonstrated that American combined arms doctrine could defeat the best the Wehrmacht had to offer. And they established tactical principles that military forces worldwide still use today, all because one stubborn commander refused to fight the war the way the textbooks said it should be fought. Wood understood that in modern mechanized warfare, speed and coordination were more valuable than heavy armor. He understood that mobility was the ultimate form of defense. He understood that giving junior officers freedom to adapt created better outcomes than rigid adherence to plans. The Army relieved him of command for these beliefs. History proved him right. The real tragedy isn't that Wood died unrecognized. It's that military institutions continue making the same mistake. They continue punishing the difficult innovators, the argumentative subordinates, the unconventional thinkers, who see what needs to change before everyone else does. They continue choosing comfortable mediocrity over uncomfortable excellence. But every once in a while, someone like John S. Wood gets the opportunity to prove what they can do. And when that happens, the results change history. That's the power of refusing to accept that things have to be done the way they've always been done. That's what happens when talent and opportunity align even briefly, even over the objections of bureaucrats and traditionalists. Aracourt proved that the supposed fatal mistake was actually brilliant strategy. That the overextended position was actually perfect bait. That the difficult officer everyone wanted to silence was actually the tactical genius the Army needed. Sometimes the people who seem most wrong are actually most right. Sometimes the ideas that seem most crazy are actually most necessary. And sometimes, just sometimes, those ideas get their moment to shine before the institution crushes the person who had them. That's the real lesson of those 11 days in September 1944. When American combined arms warfare came of age in the foggy fields of Lorraine. Innovation requires courage, excellence requires the freedom to fail, and changing the world requires refusing to accept that the world can't be changed.